An old Italian motto says, two things are certain. One is death, and the other one is using cinematic textures if you are a media music composer. Let's forget about the former for a second, and let's concentrate on three techniques that I use all the time when I have to create that kind of sound, both as a composer, as a developer of sample libraries. I know that you already have bazillions of libraries that are based exactly on that kind of sound, hopefully mine as well. But creating your own sounds is fun, sets you apart from other composers, so let's jump into it and I'll show you three different techniques for cinematic textures. The first technique that I would like to show you is based on grain cloud sampling. I'm pretty sure that many of you are familiar with a grain cloud sampler. Very briefly, a grain cloud sampler breaks down the sample in many small chunks, the grains, which swarm, let's say, randomly around an audio region within that sample, okay? And most of the grain cloud sampler available on the market allow you to control, for example, the size of the grains of these small audio regions, how they are spread out in the stereo image, how many of them are there, if they are close to each other or if they are spread out along the audio region. So you have control on all of these things. As I say, there are many, but the basic concept is pretty much this one. And for this video, I'm using this device that is a Max for Live device. I'm a very happy Ableton Live user, so whenever I find something interesting that is Max for Live instrument, I always jump on it. And this is Grain Scanner, which is produced, I think, by this company called Amazing Noises. Well, I don't know them, but I purchased it. Well, everything that I'm going to show you for third-party instrument is something that I pay. Okay, just to be clear. And it's a very, very good grain cloud sampler. I mean, I really like the kind of sound that you can produce. Well, you can do bazillions of sounds with these techniques, but for this one, we're going to concentrate, as I said, on cinematic textures. And I'm using as a sample this one that if you own Stringake, you might be familiar with that. It's a sample from Stringake. It belongs to the source sounds. As you probably know, all of our libraries have the sample folder that is open and accessible. So even if you want to completely skip the contact instruments, you can go straight to the sample folder and you can take samples from there and use them in a third-party sampler like I'm going to do now. And so this is the sample, and you can see all these controls: duration, layers, pan variation, chance, reverse, etc. And I've selected this very small audio region you can see here highlighted in gray at the beginning. Duration basically sets the length of each grain. Layers sets the amount of grains that you want. And scan sets the speed at which the sampler scans actually the sample. And then pan variation sets how spread out are the grains in the stereo image. So let's listen what happens. So as you can hear, it's like the sample actually melts down, okay, and creates this swirling kind of effect with these old pitch bendings and all these kind of unsettling effects. And this is just this small audio region. So when you are using this technique, you can even turn a very tiny amount of audio into something like this, which, you know, it already takes me there, you know, in a kind of aesthetic context that, of course, reminds of horror and thriller movies, okay? And by playing around with these settings, you can come up with very different kind of tones and sounds. But for textures, you don't want a grainy, you know, metallic sci-fi kind of sound, which you would obtain by turning down, for example, a lot the duration of the grains. You would have something like this. You know, it's way more sci-fi. But if you turn it up, you know, to 1 point something seconds, you have all these small chunks of that duration that swirl around the stereo image, and I really like it. And let's give a try to another sample from String Egg that I've used. It's this one. It's a violin sample. Okay, let's see what happens if I send it to the to Grain Scanner. Oh wow, I like this one. I really like this one. You know, it's very intensive, you know. And you can have fun for hours by doing this kind of stuff. And I guarantee you that by doing a little bit of experimentation on sampling and the parameters in the sampler, you can come up with these very interesting textures quite easily. And something that I do a lot is to layer something like this. Now this is based on strings. You know, it has a very interesting, you know, unsettling sound, but to my ears, it lacks a little bit of the body that is very typical of string sound. And so let's layer it with this instance of Dojo, which is a library that I released last year, which by the way includes two different instruments. One is the Kumite synth that is more based on aggressive synthetic sounds, whereas this one, Kata synth, is based on more, you know, atmospheric long sounds. And the preset that I'm playing now, well, let's play it solo. You know, it's pure strings with no, let's say, further processing applied. So it's a very organic sound. And let's see how it sounds if I layer it with this one. So, you know, it both has the body of this layer of organic strings plus this unsettling layer that immediately recreates an hover kind of aesthetic frame, I would say. And a lot of the layers of the sounds that you can find in Dojo have been created pretty much with this technique. Well, you have strings here, but there is tons of snapshots, for example, keys, pads, textures. Most of them have been created with this kind of technique based on grain cloud sampling. The second technique that I'm going to show you is based on time stretch. And of course, there is plenty of samplers out there that are capable of very good time stretch. It's mostly used for percussive things and stuff like that. But personally, I used a lot to create this kind of sound, this kind of, you know, ethereal layers, etc. And I'm a huge fan of Falcon by UVI. Once again, I paid for this. So what I'm saying is completely unbiased, but I really love Falcon because it's a, as they call it, it's a Swift knife. How's that called? Well, yeah, it's a Swift knife for sound design, and it really is because you can do a lot of stuff. And what I'm going to use here is called IRCAM Scrub, which is a particular algorithm of time stretch that has been developed by the IRCAM Institute in Paris, which keeps the time stretching very simply, you know, very smooth and very organic. And so I'm taking this other sample from Zittergeist. I think it's called, yeah, Apulian Zither bass tone. Well, let's have a listen to it. Should be, yeah, this one. So it has a lot of interesting bass sounds, plus this, you know, kind of trembling that is happening in the higher part of the spectrum. And so I've layered a scrubbed version, a stretched version of this sample with another oscillator, which is basically brown noise, because it adds a lot of rumble that is typical of more atonal kind of texture. And so let's have a listen. Well, Well, this one is not as tonal as the previous one, which was kind of noisy, but this one, it's pretty hard to find a fundamental, but you can need this kind of sounds. Yeah. Yeah, now I can hear fundamental way better. Well, as you can see, the sample is literally scrubbed back and forth because you have this command here that is called direction, which I'm controlling with this LFO so that it goes back and forth. And every time, at every pass, to my ears, it emphasizes a different detail of the sound, so it keeps the whole thing evolving. Another technique that I use a lot for cinematic texture, but for plenty of other things, is physical modeling. Well, physical modeling is a very broad word for a number of synthesis techniques that aim to replicate the behavior of acoustic instruments and acoustic objects. As I say, it's very wide. There are a number of different techniques, and there's plenty of synth, of course, that are based on physical modeling. But the very rough basic principle is that you have an exciter that works as a source, which is fed to another module, so to speak, that is the resonator, that aims to replicate how a real object responds when it's excited, very, very basically. And you can create literally different, very, very, very different kind of sounds with physical modeling. But let's see here how you can use it to create textures. And I'll show you several examples. Let's start with this first one, and I'll show you this old reactor patch that is called, reactor ensemble that is called Space Drone. Well, of course, this is a droney sound, but let's try to make it a little bit more detailed and interesting. And I'll use this other instruments that I really love, that is called Shade, again by UVI. Shade is basically, okay, let me stop this for a second. Shade is basically an EQ, but with a lot of, let's say, filtering possibilities, different kind of filters. And for the way it's structured, it's very well versed for physical modeling. So let's open this drone from Reactor again, and let's activate Shade. As you can see what is happening here, I've used this EQ that is basically made of all of these peaks, okay, that emphasize a lot of the partials of the input sound. Now, given that the input sound is basically brown noise, if you send it to a filter like this that extracts, so to speak, given partial, you will start hearing a tone, and you can hear this silky kind of layer that is in the higher end of the spectrum. And if we add also some grain delay, we create a more fluctuating kind of atmosphere. Well, I really like that. And by playing around with parameters both of the source and the resonator, you can come up with a lot of different sound. For example, the most simple thing is to transpose the spectrum to a lower frequency, play around with these other parameters. Or I can play around with Reactor. You can see that there are these small, slowly evolving details that create very interesting sounds to my ears. Well, let's see another example of how you can use physical modeling to create interesting and detailed textures. Here I have an instance of Drift, which is an Ableton Live synth, incredible synth, I really like it a lot. And let's hear the sound. It's a very, very, very basic kind of sound. Okay, very short, percussive kind of sound, okay, that resembles somewhat, some percussion. But the reason why I'm using this sound is because I'm using it as an exciter to be sent into a resonator. And again, I'm using Shade. Again, here you can see this filter that basically you know, has all these peaks that extract some partial in the original sound. And so if I play it, you know, this kind of bells, you know, metallic sound comes up. And if before shades I use this instance of grain space, which is an amazing grain delay by Audiority, by the amazing Luca Capozzi, good friend of mine, and great developer. So if you don't have this thing, go get it. Again, I paid for this, and I'm more than happy that I did, because Luca's stuff is amazing. So well, let's turn off shade for a second. With the grain delay, the previous ticking sound becomes something like this. It's kind of broken down plastic pieces. This comes to my mind. And if I send all of that into the resonator that I created with shade, you know, they have all of these kind of swirling bells. And let's put some reverb. I'm using hybrid reverb in Ableton Live. Listen here. Really like this one. And of course you can change, well, ideally you can, there is a way, you can associate this frequency to the keys that you are playing and play it like it was a, you know, a tonal instrument. But, you know, something that I do a lot is to just record myself while I'm playing around with these kind of patches and come up with something like this. You know, it sounds very atmospheric and interesting, because it leans a little bit between something that is familiar, because it sounds like realistic bells, and something that is not, because at the same time there is a, you know, a surreal dimension to it, I would say. And once that you have recorded yourself for a while, you know, playing around with this stuff, you can resample it. And for example, of this recording, I've taken just this very last part and I've looped the internal region of this part that I highlighted, and listen to this. It sounds really beautiful to me. So once that you sample, you know, parts of your performance, you know, you can play around as they were keys, basically. So this sounds kind of lay between a textural sound and a more keys kind of sound. Okay, there are plenty of sounds in Dojo, my library that I showed you before, that are, you know, of this more or less, you know, based on this very same style. Another synth that I use a lot to do interesting physical modeling stuff is Aive by Madrona Labs, which basically is based on the same concept that I've done right now with input plus grain delay plus resonator. Aive does all of that in one plugin, with the difference that the way they have modeled the resonators is based on a not very common technique, but that creates very realistic sounds. For example, here I'm feeding to Aive this sound from our free library Relic, which is an cinematic impact sound, which is granulized here. Here there is the whole granulator section, which is then sent to this resonator. And now I'm simulating a large chime resonator. So let's have a listen to how it sounds. Wow. And here you can do something very similar. Record yourself while you play around with these samples, and then use that recording to create something else. I'll do another example of another interesting sound that I created in Aive. Let's hear. And I've recorded some of these sounds. I'll play them for you. Something like this from Aive. You know, when you play around with grain sampling and physical modeling, you have to really be open to the unexpected. Maybe the same patch played the same way produces very different sounds. And then I have fed Granulator 2, which is another very interesting grain sampler in Ableton Live with these sounds right here. And let's see what happens. Wow, that's very interesting. I might layer it with the previous metallic belt sounds. Let's see how it sounds. Wow, sounds really great to my ears. Whereas this one, I believe, is another instance of granulator with one of the sounds that come from Aive, which is a little bit more eerie to my ears. Let's see, let's listen. Wow. Well, it sounds a little bit like kind of mangled strings to my ears. And as I said, in Dojo, my library that I released last years in the Kata synth, you can find plenty of sounds that have been more or less created with this technique. Not just this technique, but also these ones. And this is one that I particularly like. Also, the name is very cool. The Machine is Alive, because I think that I created by granulating I don't know, maybe the noise of my broken oven that I used to have last year. Let's listen. As you can see in Dojo, you have this big square right here, which is basically an XY controller, where you can drag around this cursor, and according to what is mapped to the X and Y direction respectively, you can modulate all of these layers at once. For example, we have a morph between layer 1 and 2 on Y, and a cut off of this other layer on X. And you have this sort of swirling, evolving effect if you just hold one note, for example, and play around with the cursor. And you can also map the movement of the cursor to MIDI control of your keyboard. For example, CCX and CCY. Let's map this one to 113 on my C board, and 114, which is basically the XY pad controller on the Rolly Seaboard Rise. Should work, yeah. So let's hear. Really like this one. Guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this video. These are just some of the techniques that I use to create textures. Actually, you can come up with literally endless way to create these sort of atmospheric sounds. and I hope that you have found something interesting and inspiring in what I share with you right now. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time. Bye.